Hey guys and welcome back to my channel. This is third part of what if Luffy ate the storm fruit and was the captain of the storm pirates. Before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe for more amazing content, and also go and support the author, link in description. Days after days passed, and the crew was still staying in Piirates. Luffy was still trying to convince Sanji to join their crew, but the blonde just wouldn't budge, his mind as hard as a rock. Despite standing in one place, they weren't exactly doing nothing. Luffy was still training his crew in hockey, ensuring they would be ready for the Grand Line. While standing here, Luffy noticed that the restaurant owner wasn't exactly just an old man. He wondered just how strong he truly was. Right now, the crew was busy eating their breakfast. Well, they were trying to eat. If it wasn't for Luffy eating everything, except for Nami's food, that was the only food he didn't try to eat. One client of the restaurant looked outside the window, only to gasp before screaming like a little girl. That's Don Krieg's pirate ship. Luffy curiously looked outside to see the ship of the so-called Admiral of the Pirates of East Blue, or whatever he was called. Luffy didn't bother remembering it. Looking at the flag, "That's a very stupid flag," Luffy commented. Nami giggled at her lover while Zoro was itching for a good fight. The clients run away from Piirates as fast as possible, not wanting to meet their demise from a fearful pirate as Don Krieg. The cooks soon started blaming Patty for Don Krieg's arrival since, in their minds, he wouldn't have come here if he had served his men when he was here. "We are in so much trouble, Luffy, shouldn't we sail away?" Usopp asked, his voice trembling. Luffy didn't pay him attention, he was more focused on the coming ship, wondering if this could be his chance to convince Sanji to join the crew. Nami wanted to see how strong the Admiral Pirate of East Blue, Don Krieg, was compared to Luffy. "Do you believe Jin returned to pay his debt?" the captain, wearing a straw hat, inquired. "I have my doubts." Sanji drew a pull from his cigarette and smiled. "However, something's not right." They were all watching as the ship emerged from the early mist in clear view. Well, what was left of the ship? That ship has sunk. What kind of storm did they find themselves in? The gigantic galleon was, as Sanji predicted, a complete catastrophe. The sails were ripped and shredded. The screaming saber-toothed cat figurehead was half gone. About halfway up, the main mast was damaged, the wood seemed to be barely holding together. The ship looked to have barely survived a massive storm. The front door of the restaurant crashed open, showing a massive man. Soon they saw the big man was actually supported by none other than Jin, who was desperately trying to hold him standing. Who the Straw Hat crew knew was Don Krieg looked different than they expected. He had gray hair and bushy sideburns and bandages wrapped over his head. Please help me. I need food." The man identified as Don Krieg spoke, his voice weak and trembling. "Please, I need food and water. If it's money you want, I have enough." "What the heck is going on?" Patty asked before his eyes found the so-called Admiral of Pirates. "Is this half-dead looking person really Don Krieg?" he said, but more like taunting the pirate. Krieg tried to take another before his legs couldn't hold his weight anymore, and he collapsed to the floor. "Don Krieg!" Jin screamed. "Please, get some food and drink for him. He can't last that much longer." He searched a sea of faces for someone to sympathize with. There was none to be discovered since Zeph wasn't here, and Sanji and the Straw Hats were off to the side. No one moved to help him, and he had a look of incredulity on his face. "Ha ha ha ha." Patty erupted in laughter. "To think the dangerous Don Krieg really is, collapsing in the floor like an egg. This time, we're paying consumers. We've got cash. There's enough of it. You have no right to reject us, darn it." Jin screamed angrily. Patty didn't pay him attention. Instead, he turned at the rest of the cooks. "Someone call the Marines. They'll never get another opportunity like this," Patty said before turning at Jin, who was glaring at him. "Don't give him even a glass of water." The cooks seemed to agree with what Patty was saying. Don was a dangerous pirate. They couldn't take the chance, not mentioning Don Krieg was known to be a piece of shit pirate. "I'm not going to hurt anyone," Krieg begged, barely saying his words. "If you give me food, I swear I'll go away peacefully. Please. Help me." He was on his knees, begging. "Captain, you should not do something like this. You're a great pirate, you shouldn't drop your head in front of others," Jin said with tears in his eyes. Krieg ignored his men and instead begged more. Even the leftovers would do as long as it was food. Most of the crew was shocked to see a pirate like Don Krieg on his knees begging, except Luffy, Zoro, and Nami. Nami knew the man was lying because she used this trick sometimes to get what she wanted. While humiliating, it worked most of the time. Are you trying to make us cry? You will get no food here, Patty said with a chuckle. Before Patty could say anything else, his face was kicked, sending him crashing against the wall by none other than Sanji, who was holding a plate with food and a bottle of wine. Jin, hand this over to him. Krieg began scarfing down his dinner with moans of relief as the two gaped in amazement. Sanji. One cook shouted in terror. Doesn't Sanji understand who he was helping? He started explaining how Don Krieg had attacked peaceful ports and how he would use marine flags to fool the villages not to attack him on sight, how he had betrayed and killed people behind their backs. Someone like him should starve to death, that's what a monster like him deserves, he shouted, and soon everything he said was proven right. Sanji was suddenly sent flying across the room by Don Krieg, who was grinning from ear to ear, an empty plate in his left hand before he threw it away. Zoro looked unamused but not shocked. Nami clenched her teeth. This pirate was no different than that monster. Usopp was trembling like a leaf. On the other hand, Luffy just stood, his arms crossed in front of his chest, his eyes covered by his straw hat. Everyone was surprised and scared by the sudden change of events, but Jin felt betrayed more than anything. Captain Krieg! Exclaims Jin. You promised you wouldn't hurt anyone. That guy gave me food, he saved us. Don Krieg's huge hand grabbed his shoulder and crushed it. Jin screamed in agony from the pain. I have never tasted such delicious dish, Don Krieg said, smirking at the rest of the cooks who took steps back, away from him. It seems the snake finally bares his venomous teeth. Sanji said, not harmed by the pitiful attack of Krieg. Good ship you have here, Don said, looking around before setting his eyes on the cooks. Is mine now, he stated with a growing smirk. My ship is almost destroyed, Krieg spoke with a smirk, almost hungry tone. I'm in need of a new one. This ship is perfect, but don't worry, you all can go peacefully. Don Krieg said with a growing smirk on his face. On my ship, I still have 100 men who are all hungry. You'll make enough food to feed them all. He ordered the cooks, who didn't even move an inch to complete his orders. What are you waiting for? Do it now, some have already died from hunger. Feed 100 guys who will only attack us after we have done so. You've got to be joking, right? We won't. It seems that you were under the assumption that it was a request, Krieg responded solemnly, making many chefs uncomfortable at his tone. I issued an order, and no one has broken it. I'm really sorry, Sanji, I had no idea this was going to happen. Jin said with clear regret. To this, Sanji said nothing but headed towards the kitchen, ignoring everyone until Patty shouted at him. Sanji, you fool, this is all your fault. If you had just done nothing we wouldn't be in this mess, now what do you think you're doing? What am I going to do? Isn't it obvious? I'm heading to the kitchen to prepare the food. I've got 100 men to feed. With a raised eyebrow, Sanji answered. Wise men, Don grinned in satisfaction, while the other cooks were shocked by Sanji's words. Like hell you will, they all said before pointing their guns at him, warning him. Tell us, Sanji, are you some kind of secret Krieg agent? One asked, looking at Sanji, who didn't look fazed by their guns. Then go ahead and shoot, Sanji said flatly, not fazed in the least. The chefs screamed and jerked their firearms back. Do you think I'm not aware that they're scum? The blonde made a sneering remark. As a cook is my sworn duty to feed hungry people, save those bullets for his men if they decide to attack. He said before smoking his cigarette. I provide food for hungry people. What happens to them after that is irrelevant to me. I'll murder them personally if they decide to bite the hand that fed them. Patty struck Sanji in the back of the head with his massive hands, ignoring what Sanji was saying. This is getting out of hand, Nami commented at her crew. Usopp wondered why they were still here. To begin with, Zoro was just looking bored, waiting for permission to cut them down like dogs. Hold this fool down, Patty ordered at the others. I have seen you giving food to people I turned away, but back then I didn't say anything since I couldn't tell who was right and who was wrong. But this time, you're completely incorrect. I'm going to defend this place by myself. He pulled the cover off his package, showing a big, shrimp-shaped hand cannon. Fortunately, we just have to deal with Krieg. He won't be able to defeat all of us. He raised the gun and aimed it. This is Piirates, a prideful place. Every day, pirates arrive with the intent of causing havoc. We're more than capable of dealing with people like you. The cook stated, aiming his gun at the pirate captain, who narrowed his eyes. Don Krieg, we still haven't served the dessert, how about some now? Meatball of doom. Patty screamed and launched a cannonball at Krieg. The ball collided with the hulking pirate, engulfing him in a massive explosion. Don. As his captain was thrown through the doors and out of the restaurant, Jin shouted, thinking his captain was dead. Shit, I blasted the door. Zeph will have my head, Patty said nervously. It's all right, Patty. Carne said, reassuring him. It was to protect this place. Chef Zeph will understand. What about his men? They're still in the ship, Sanji asked from where he was standing on the floor. Patty turned to him. How about we smear butter on the ship and light it on fire, he suggested, with many approving of his idea. That dessert was very heavy, not even a one-star restaurant. Krieg stepped back into the room, unscathed. His body was covered in golden armor from neck to torso. You dirty pirate, rush him, Patty screamed, and all of the chefs rushed the enormous guy, wielding massive tableware-styled weapons. Do you have any idea with who you are dealing with? Krieg yelled as he drew 2 handguns from his armor and 10 more from different sections of his body. He quickly started fire. But the bullets didn't reach any of them. Instead, between Don and the cook stood one Monkey D. Luffy. One thing many noticed was his body wasn't wounded. Instead, the places where the bullet should have penetrated were dark clouds, making tiny sparks around Luffy. Who are you? Don demanded. Who was he to do this? This warn. On the other hand, Sanji murmured under his breath, the Arashi no mi fruit, with a slight shiver, knowing this fruit was no joke. My name is Monkey D. Luffy, and I believe you're not welcome here anymore, Luffy stated with a serious look. Zoro at the side smirked, his hand on the pommel of his swords. Nami was impressed that Luffy saved the cooks from the bullets, before grabbing her staff, preparing to fight for her captain. Usopp looked insecure before swallowing a huge breath. This was his chance to show he was not a coward. Johnny and Yosaku followed what Zoro did, ready to protect Big Bro Luffy. You tiny worms believe you're going to be able to defeat me. I'm the most powerful man to ever exist. My armor is made of gold. Nothing can penetrate it. No one has ever been able to defeat me. I'm the strongest, he claimed in front of everyone. You done? That query was met with dead silence as Krieg glared at Luffy, wrath actually flowing from him as a vein visible on his forehead pulsed. You really think you're the strongest? Your name is neither Whitebeard, nor Kaido or Dragon or Shanks, so you're nothing, Luffy said with a serious look. What was that brat? Don shouted in anger. Did I say anything that wasn't clear? I have known people who could defeat you in their sleep, Luffy said as he thought of his grandpa, Mihawk, Shanks and many others. Krieg was about to attack when a huge bag dropped in front of him. What is this? Owner Zeph. The chefs screamed in disbelief. 100 men's food, Zeph answered sluggishly. Get it to your men as soon as possible. Did they say, Zeph? Krieg seemed to be sweating profusely. Sir, you couldn't possibly feed them that. They're going to go after the ship once they've recovered. A chef screamed. Oh, they'll do it, won't they? Krieg's expression clouded, but Zeph's smile remained. That is if they still have any fighting spirit. Grand Line dropouts, isn't that correct? Not even Don Krieg make it. The chefs were ecstatic. The Grand Line vanquished the strongest of the East Blue. Jin had a horrified look on his face, remembering that cursed place. You're Zeph, Red Leg. Krieg looked at Zeph as if he couldn't believe he was speaking to him. Captain and the amazing chef. So you're still alive, right? And you have nothing to do with my existence. As you can see, I'm currently working as a full-time chef. Zeph responded with not a single hint of fear in his eyes. A full-time cook. That's a clever way of putting things. It would be more accurate to remark that there is nothing more you can do right now. Krieg let out a hushed chuckle. To hear about Red Leg Zeph is to hear of a warrior who could kick so hard that the blood of his adversaries would stain his shoes, a man who could destroy rocks with just his legs and leave impressions on steel. In a battle, the guy who would never use his hands. You've devolved into a ridiculous nobody. Are you a full-time cook? Ha! You'll never be able to put your red shoes back on. You've become a chef because it's the only thing you know how to do. He smiled. According to what I've heard, you perished in a shipwreck. You appear to have made it out alive, although at the sacrifice of one of your precious legs. You can't fight now that it's gone. Sanji had a look of utter rage on his face as if he wanted to rip Krieg apart himself. It doesn't matter whether I can fight or not as long as I have these hands. I'm still a decent chef. Zeph responded indifferently. Are you going to get to the point, or are you going to babble on and on? The Grand Line, you not only navigated those seas, but you did it safely. You must have maintained a journal of your journey. Give it to me. Krieg was adamant. Hearing this, Luffy's eyes turned to stars, wanting to know about this old man who apparently had been in Grand Line. You have been in Grand Line? Luffy asked eagerly. Yes, kid, Zeph confirmed the news. And you're correct. I did keep a journal. It is still in my possession today. But I'm not going to pass it up to the likes of you. My staff and I are really proud of that logbook. It's much too precious to entrust to a weakling like you. Weakling. Krieg screamed angrily. I have never been defeated. I can crush mountains with my bare hands. How dare you call me a weakling? He boasted his achievements. It's pointless to explain it to someone as stupid as you are, Zeph responded, not showing the slightest hint of fear. In that case I will rip it off your dead corpse. Grand Line might have defeated me, but I'm still the most powerful man in the world. Don Krieg. It was merely a matter of lack of knowledge on my part. It was the only defect I had. That's why I'm going to take your logbook. I'll rebuild my squad and tackle the Grand Line once I have it. I'll track down One Piece and rise to the throne of the Pirate King. Even Kobe has more chances becoming the Pirate King than you do, not mentioning there can be only one Pirate King. That's me, Luffy stated right in front of Don, who was red in the face from anger. The other cooks backed away in fear, while Sanji and Zeph stood their grounds. Are you planning on fighting, Luffy? Zoro asked, pulling out his most powerful sword. Is that your team? 2 punks and a young lady. Are you trying to mark me? Laugh. Krieg sneered. You forgot him, Luffy said, pointing at Sanji, who was roaring in denial. Don't make fun of me, you scumbag. Krieg finally lost his cool. On that nightmarish sea, my whole 5,000-man crew was wiped out. All because we lacked the necessary information. It wouldn't make a difference even if you had 50,000 soldiers. If you aren't powerful enough, the Grand Line will put you to death. This is how the term, Pirates' Graveyard, came about. Luffy stated. As Krieg's face went crimson with wrath, everyone in the room remained silent. Only 100 people out of 5,000 made it back. I'm surprised that those 100 has not yet abandoned you, Luffy spoke. You little worm, I will kill you. Once I skin you, I will rape that little boy. To everyone else, everything that happened next was only a blur. Only Zeph was able to kind of follow Luffy's move. Don himself didn't understand what had happened before he coughed blood from his mouth, his body not moving, the feelings of his limbs disappeared, as if they weren't there anymore, his eyes started bleeding, but despite the blood, he felt no pain, he felt nothing. The others saw what a moment ago was his chest, but instead, there was a hole almost the size of a hand, blood leaking like rain, as the boards went red with blood. Captain, Jin exclaimed in horror. Don wanted to ask why he was screaming before everything slowly went dark. The last thing he saw was the boards coming towards him. His body fell on the floor, Luffy standing just 1 meter from where the dead pirate stood. Almost everyone paled at the speed demonstrated by Luffy, whose right hand was red with blood. Nami smiled at her captain. While it wasn't the first time she got threats like that, she was happy that her captain protected her dignity from garbage like Don. Zoro, on the other hand, looked annoyed that he wasn't the one to defeat Don Krieg. Usopp had gone as pale as snow. He gulped and made a mental note to never piss off Luffy. Sanji looked shocked, but not from the power, but more the captain protected the dignity of his crew. A smile crept on his face. It seemed Luffy wasn't someone to leave his nakama behind. Luffy approached the bag of food and took it. He turned around and went back to Jin, who was still lying on the floor, white face, dropping the heavy bag in front of the shocked guy. Feed your crew. This is your one and only opportunity. Luffy remarked while looking Jin in the eyes. You killed my captain, Jin suddenly yelled, standing up. Zoro prepared to cut him down, but Luffy raised his hand. Jin clenched the staff in his hands, ready to attack Luffy, who looked at him with a cold look, almost freezing him. I will give you one chance, grab the food and save your crewmates, but attack me, and I will make sure that you and your crew will go where your captain is. The whole atmosphere seemed to be freezing, their breath suddenly visible, some feeling cold as if winter was upon them. Jin looked at the food before looking at Luffy again, cold sweat rolling down his forehead, almost freezing on his face. The others won't be happy, he stated. Despite Don perhaps not being the best captain, he still was their captain. Were they supposed to just turn a blind eye? If they're so eager to die, then I will sink them, Luffy promised. Jin calculated his options before taking the bag and sprinting towards the galleon. What now, Captain? Usopp asked, looking where Jin left just a second ago. It's now a battle between pirate crews. Luffy expressed authoritatively. Usopp, be ready for a fight. These people aren't going anywhere if they attack us. Usopp nodded and left to fetch his guns from the Going Merry. Luffy then turned to face Zeph and addressed the former pirate. I'm sorry for the trouble, but maybe your staff of chefs should back away. If they decide to attack, then this could get ugly. You don't have to apologize, kid. On this ship, everyone did what they felt was the right thing to do. Several chefs started screaming that they were in this trouble because Sanji decided to help them. One of them turned and even started accusing Sanji for wanting to take Zeph's place as the main chef of Baratie. Sanji was getting annoyed with him, ready to kick his face. Enough you fools, the chefs flinched back, wide-eyed at Zeph, as he shouted. Do any of you have any idea what it's like to be hungry, really hungry? Do any of you know what it's like to be so hungry that you're begging to die? They were all stunned and perplexed as they gazed at him. You idiots have no idea how terrible and horrible it is to be stranded at sea without food or drink. The only difference between you and Sanji is that he understands what he's doing. With shocked expressions, the chefs turned to an unconcerned Sanji. It's pointless to weep over spilt milk. There's a door there if any of you wish to leave. Waving at the blown-out front doors, Zeph sneered. I'm going to remain right here. If I left without a battle, I wouldn't be able to live with myself. Patty said. I live and work in this restaurant as well. There's no place for me to go. Carne smiled and nodded. None of you idiots will fight any longer. Zeph was firm in his convictions, and the power with which he spoke prevented any of his chefs from disagreeing with him. This is a battle between two pirate crews, kid like him who never turn their backs on their crewmates, the likes of them are the one who can sail through the Grand Line. Owner Zeph, the chefs said in amazement after their master, listening to the assurance and fire in his words. Soon Usopp returned with his guns, ready to fight for his crew. Since we have time to find out if they will attack or not. I'd want to hear more from the elderly guy about the Grand Line. With an amused snort, Luffy chuckled as Zeph sat down with the straw hats. So, old guy, how was the Grand Line when you sailed it? With a big smile on his face, he inquired. Hey, it's been a long time since I've recounted any pirate tales. Before starting to tell about his stint as captain of the Cook Pirates, Zeph laughed. Shishishi. It sounds like a great spot to visit. It's a must for us to visit. By the conclusion of Zeph's story, Luffy was giggling uncontrollably. It seems sailing with you Luffy has been the right decision. Our roads will lead to the same place, you as Pirate King and me as the best swordsman of the world, Zoro stated. You're the kind of person that rushes to his doom. Sanji shifted his weight and exhaled the cigarette smoke. True. Zoro was quick to respond. But leave out the word, idiot. He focused his attention on the blonde cook. I've had no connection to life since I resolved to become the greatest swordsman in the world. Only I have the authority to declare myself an idiot. You're absolutely correct. Luffy smiled broadly and slammed his hand on the table. Nami chirped with a charming grin, yep. I must say the same as a guy who will be a great sea fighter. Usopp drew his arms around his chest. Zoro looked at the gunman, puzzled. Shut up, says the gunman. The swordsman grinned as the gunman snapped. Zeph had a smile on his face for the first time in a long time. He was grinning widely and gazing about at the small group of people. That sounds like my old fantasy, as well as this stupid little eggplants. Zeph laughed. You, too, Sanji, have a dream. Luffy's eyes were sparkling like stars. Are you familiar with the All Blue? As he glanced across to Luffy, Sanji groaned and let out a stream of smoke. Nope. With a shake of his head, Luffy expressed his dissatisfaction with the situation. However, I'd want to learn more about it right now. Sanji grumbled before proceeding to tell the Straw Hats about his dream with a grin on his face. Krieg's galleon. Outside, the Krieg pirates' remaining members were cheerfully devouring food, relishing the sense of power returning to their bodies. Where's the captain? One asked, looking at Jin, who felt as if a whole whale was resting on his shoulder right now. With a deep breath, Jin opened his mouth and prepared to tell them what happened with the captain is. Bharati. Sanji has just completed telling the Straw Hats about his desire to locate the All Blue. They were all enthralled by the thought of a sea that was home to every fish on the planet. Luffy was thinking of all kinds of different meat he could eat there, so much that he started drooling. Nami just giggled at her lover, knowing what he was thinking. Zoro gave Sanji a nod of acknowledgement. That was quite a dream. Even for a cook. How are you going to find the All Blue while you're here? Luffy wondered aloud whether the Bharati had gone on a search for it or something. He won't, which is why I keep urging him to get out of here and go find it. The blonde was greeted with a snarl from Zeph. You filthy geezer, shut up, Sanji responded with a grunt. You already know why I'm not going. I didn't slice off my own limb simply to prevent you from living your life and pursuing your ambitions. Zeph screamed at the blonde, and Sanji cringed at the elderly man's frank words. He has a valid argument. Luffy smiled and nodded. If finding All Blue is both of your dreams, why do you keep staying here and battling with the old man? Sanji clenched his teeth before telling them everything. Fine. Sanji clenched his teeth and smashed his cigarette into the ashtray on the table. The Straw Hats soon learnt of Sanji's past with Zeph and how the two had almost died of starvation on a godforsaken pillar of stone in the midst of the sea. To live, Zeph had given Sanji all of their food and eaten his own leg. Sanji was depressed at the end, and Zeph was stern. I agree with the old man. You can't do anything by standing here, by not going out there and fulfilling both of your dreams. You are only pissing on what the old man did for you, Luffy stated. Sanji tried to say something before Zoro stepped in. Dreams left to you by someone else should be pursued until the end of the world. Nothing, not even the danger of death, should stand in your path. Sanji attempted again, but Luffy interrupted him. Sanji, join my crew. If need be, we'll sail to the furthest reaches of the oceans. With his fist raised in front of him, Luffy said. Join us in pursuing your ambition. As he extended his hand to the blonde cook, he offered. Before starting at Zeph, Sanji examined the extended hand. Do it for both of us, son. Zeph gave a kind nod to the young guy who had grown to resemble his own son. Sanji's eyes widened as he heard Zeph's remarks and saw his surrogate father's passionate expression. Sanji made his choice by returning his gaze to Luffy and his still outstretched hand. Well, I'll be damned. It seems I'm joining Captain. Sanji sighed and smiled as he grasped Luffy's hand in his, and the two shook hands. Yeah. Luffy lifted both hands in the air as he cheered. New Nakama. The crew was listening to Zeph's stories when Luffy suddenly stood up from his chair, looking serious. The crew except Sanji understood the enemy was close. They're on their way, Nami exclaimed. Walking outside they were met with Krieg pirates holding guns and swords. We are going to take revenge for our captain. We are going to kill all of you, one shouted, immediately getting, "Yah," from all his crewmates. The Straw Hat crew didn't look intimidated by their poor try of threat. Luffy stepped forward. Zoro, cut them down, Luffy ordered without batting an eye. Zoro just smirked before jumping down right in front of the pirates who looked at Zoro as if he was mad for attacking them alone. Do you have some kind of death wish or something, boy? A pirate asked as the whole party began creeping forward. Zoro just smirked. Unsheathing only two of his swords, a part of the crew rushed towards Zoro with knives, pistols and swords. Kill him, they roared. Zoro just put two of his sword in front before making his move. Two sword style, he roared, slicing them up left and right, one by one fell from Zoro's blade and not once Zoro used his third and best sword to attack. The crew left gasped seeing each one of their crew who attacked Zoro being cut from the swordsman. Not only that but Zoro didn't have a single injury in his body. Be careful, he's the pirate hunter Roronoa Zoro, one shouted amongst the Krieg crew which resulted fear to spread even more amongst the crew left alive. Nami, Zoro, and Sanji are in charge of the attack. Without their captain, they have already lost. The three nodded in response to Luffy's words. Luffy was eager to see how far Nami had grown since her last battle. He was also curious to see what Sanji might do. Sanji just snorted as they tried to overwhelm him. They figured if they couldn't win 1vs1, they will try to win with numbers. That always worked against stronger enemies thus far. Sanji started by kicking the first fool on the jaw, breaking it. The cook didn't stop as he proceeded to kick 5 more pirates who tried to attack him. One who was shaking in fear tried to aim. Firing the bullet, Sanji dodged smoothly before kicking his gun away first and then axe kick his head. Luffy had to admit that Sanji knew how to fight. By the end, 30 unconscious and some dead pirates were lying behind Sanji who just lightened up a cigarette. Nami smirked seeing the pirates rushing towards her, the staff in her hands. She smiled seductively before sending them a wink much to Luffy's amusement. The pirates stopped dead on track by the beautiful navigator who then used her staff to hit them around. One by one fell on the ground. One tried attacking from behind with a sword. Nami's observation warned her before anything could happen. She dodged to her left before using her staff to crack his skull. The men fell dead on the water. Nami quite liked it being able to defend herself. Another group of pirates aimed at her with guns from a safe distance. Luffy wondered if he would have to intervene. But Nami, much to the surprise of everyone, jumped in the air right as the bullets flew at the other direction. Nami hit one in the head before striking each one that dared to shoot at her. Nami was searching for her next enemy when something emerged from the ocean. Turning around she was met with the most ridiculous custom in the world. The new person. At first Nami wondered what she was looking at only to realize that was just a man who needed to dress better. Behold me. I'm Pearl the Iron Wall, he shouted proudly of himself. Luffy tilted his head at the side in confusion. Was there some kind of rule in Krieg Pirates that only if you're a cocky person you can join the crew? He possessed massive iron plates on both his front and back, giving him a spherical appearance. They were all over him, from the crotch to collar. Smaller iron plates were affixed to his feet, knees, elbows, wrists, and even his skull, each with a brilliant-looking pearl in the center. You might have defeated my crewmates, but unlike them, I'm invisible. That's right, now that Don Krieg is dead. I'm in charge of Krieg Pirates. I will be the one to become the Pirate King, he proclaimed loudly. Nami just rolled her eyes. This was some kind of clown. Even Buggy was more menacing. You Pirate King, PFF. I have seen many pirates dressing up like weird people but you take the center stage, Nami said, bored of this, but in same time she wondered how much worth were the pearls around his armor. You. A little girl like you, please look at my handsome face. You will end up jumping like all the girls. I've won every battle without a single scratch. That little stick of yours won't be able to penetrate my iron shield. I have never lost not even a single drop of blood. I'm invisible, he proclaimed proudly with a smirk not leaving his face. Nami just rolled her eyes again before rushing at him. She aimed towards an unprotected area of his body, but the man moved his plate to dodge her attack. Trying to strike, Nami saw it coming before whirling around. She had to admit that he was faster than she anticipated. Creating a distance between her and him, a smirk grew on his face, thinking that he had Nami on the ropes. Rushing forward, he kept trying to hit Nami but she kept dodging due to her observation haki. Nami moved to her right. The man immediately tried to strike her face with his left arm. Nami smirked before dodging his strike and delivering a full blown on his elbow, breaking it in the process. The bone stick out, blood pouring out much to the horror of the man who fell on his knees from the pain. Blood, my blood, please help me somebody. I'm bleeding, he shouted in fear, desperately trying to use his other arm, but his arm was completely immobile and the weight of his armor was only making things worse to his broken bone. The man tried to put his arms together, but Nami just rushed forward. The man saw her coming, striking with his good arm desperately hoping to smash her head with his armor. Nami just dodged to her left before breaking his other arm. Before the man could scream, Nami smashed her staff right at his forehead, Cracking his skull, the man fell dead on the floor. Luffy smiled at Nami, happy that he didn't need to do anything for her to win. The navigator was proud of herself, she was finally able to stand up against men like him. Now that the party seems to be over, she started observing the pearls around his armor. Sanji smoked from his cigarette when Jin slowly came out from inside the ship. Luffy raised an eyebrow at Zoro, wanting to know what was up. He was tightened with ropes inside the deck, and it seems he tried to stop them. Zoro spoke. Everyone nodded and could see Jin was heavily injured, his face full of blood. What will you do now, Jin? Sanji asked, stepping forward, wondering if the man had anywhere to go. I will return back to my hometown. My mother is still there. I will become what she always wanted me to be, a farmer, Jin replied with a cheeky grin before turning to look at Luffy with a severe look. I underestimated you, Luffy. Your crew is strong, especially you, and I'm not talking just you, your whole crew is capable. If anyone can become the Pirate King, it will be you, Jin stated smiling. Luffy returned the smile. It's finished. Zoro drew all three of his blades and sheathed them. Sanji grimaced as he took a cigarette from his pocket and lit it. Usopp had been able to kill at least 9 pirates using his slingshot and guns. Sanji decided to go back to the restaurant. He needed to discuss a few things with Zeph. Nami walked up to Luffy who smiled before kissing her sweet lips. Nami happily returned the kiss, her arms behind his neck to deepen the kiss. They shortly parted away. Nami could feel her heart racing with desire, but this wasn't the place for that, maybe later. You did very well, Nami. I'm impressed, Luffy complimented. Thank you, but now that we have defeated the pirates, now the best part comes, Nami said, her eyes suddenly sparking like a star. Luffy tilted his head at the side in confusion. We can finally claim every bit of treasure I have left, Nami exclaimed suddenly with berry eyes, looking at the enemy ship with lust. Luffy laughed before nodding his head. Very well, Nami. You know these things. After giving her the green light, Nami didn't waste time to look around the Krieg ship, soon followed by the others since they needed to help with heavy chests. Luffy made his way to the idiot that Nami killed. He could tell the pearls around his body were valuable. Turning his hand into lightning, he removed each pearl plate from his body. Usopp soon came out from the ship carrying an open chest filled with gold coins, jewelry, and many other things. Nami came out with her own chest carrying in her arms. Soon the whole ship was empty of every bit of treasure. Luffy grabbed a handful of gold coins from a chest before turning at Jin who was eating inside the restaurant. Sanji had apparently prepared something for him since he had tried to stop the pirates from attacking. This time the chefs weren't opposed to it. Walking up to him, he put the coins in front of him. Jin stopped eating and looked up at Luffy in confusion. Take these, your homeland might need it, Luffy said with a tone that clearly didn't take no for an answer. Jin swallowed his head. A smile formed on his face. Eventually tears formed on the corner of his eyes. He stood up before bowing his head toward Luffy. Thank you for this. You have brought a big smile in my face, Jin said smiling and crying at the same time. Luffy smiled back and did the same for Piirates since a part of their restaurant was destroyed during the attack. Surprisingly, Nami didn't try to stop Luffy, instead she gave him an encouraging smile. Zoro smiled as well. He knew his captain was different from the others, but Luffy was much more different. Sanji said nothing, but one could see a small smile on his face. Luffy suddenly smirked and jerked his head around so rapidly that everyone feared he'd suffer whiplash. What's the matter, Luffy? Nami was perplexed since she had never seen her captain act like this before. Usopp wondered if there was any enemy around them but couldn't see anyone. He's here, Luffy claimed. He focused his sight on the little sailboat approaching the Piirates, while the ship sailing towards Piirates was nothing to be scared of, but the person sailing on it was someone that put Zeph on high alert. Luffy kept his cool, but he prepared to fight if he needed to fight. Zoro's eyes widened in shock before a smirk formed on his face, knowing the day had come, sooner than he had expected. The ship looked like a coffin. Candles appeared to blaze with green fire around the edges, and the mast resembled an intricate cross. Zoro's concentration was on the guy sitting on the solitary seat aboard the coffin-like boat, his legs crossed. It was a legend, a swordsman known around the 4 seas, with black hair and striking golden eyes. He had a short beard, mustache, and sideburns that were all well clipped to seem pointed. He was dressed in an open, long black coat with no shirt. It was crimson on the inside, with red sleeves and a floral design on his collar. His bright purple slacks were tucked into buckled boots. He wore a plumed hat with a big brim. A necklace with a pendant in the form of a huge cross draped around his neck. And what about on his back? A long, black sword hung from his back, its grip a smaller, more ornate replica of the cross that served as his ship's mast. How the hell did he get here in such a small boat? One cook asked, shouted. Idiot. Zoro took a deep breath and gently exhaled. Right now, it was the least important question that could be posed. What is he doing here? Zeph asked. His breath stuck on his throat, his eyes glanced at the pirate crew, mostly at the captain. He could tell, no one else could, but Zeph could see the captain was on guard, especially his muscles that looked tense. He wondered if any of them would survive this day. It solely depended on the coming swordsman. The world's greatest swordsman. Zoro flashed a sly smile. Dracule Mahawk. Dracule glanced at the destroyed Krieg ship. A frown formed on his face before noticing the familiar face of one monkey, especially his straw hat. It has been a while, Luffy-kun, Mahawk said with a smirk. Now, Luffy grinned. Indeed it has. Hawkeye-sensei. All of the cooks had made their way outside and are now standing behind Zoro and Zeph, who were observing Hawkeye's conversation with Luffy. Luffy's right-hand man, Zoro, was looking at Hawkeye with a gleeful expression. There he is, achieving our dream is closer than ever before, Zoro thought excitedly as he placed his hands on his swords. Zoro remembered his captain calling him a sensei. That confused Zoro since his captain hadn't mentioned anything of being trained by Hawkeye. Why are you here? Luffy asked. He knew they were kind of friends, but still, Mahawk was equal to Shanks, to a Yonko, and that's saying a whole lot. The Krieg pirates interrupted my nap. I came here to finish them off, but it seems they were dumb enough to challenge you of all people, Mahawk stated, the smirk not leaving his face, causing everyone who wasn't Luffy to gasp at the thought of being chased by the strongest swordsman in the world just because you interrupted his nap. How is Shanks? Luffy asked, wondering what his redhead sensei was doing, assuming he was drunk somewhere or sleeping, or both. Last time I checked, he was drunk. How far have you gone? Mahawk asked, getting a bit excited to fight Luffy again. While the Storm Boy was nowhere near his level, it was still much better than fighting Shanks. They would always end in a tie. Can't wait to show you. Does Shanks know? Luffy asked since Mahawk had been in the East Blue a couple of times after Shanks had left. No, as far as he is aware, 11 years ago was the first and last time we met, Mahawk replied, only now noticing the swordsman behind Luffy. Zoro walked out from behind Luffy and moved to stand beside Luffy with his green bandana tied around his head. Luffy turned and looked at him to see what he was planning, but with one look, Luffy already knew what Zoro was planning. As Zoro was about to jump off of the restaurant and head towards Mahawk, Luffy grabbed him by the back of his shirt collar and tossed Zoro behind him. Zoro, being surprised by Luffy's action, jumped up to his feet and yelled at him. What are you doing, Captain? He asked, getting irritated. His dream was closer than ever before. Luffy didn't even glance at him, he kept his eyes solely on the warlord. Nami and Sanji could feel the tension rising, they knew something would happen soon. What do you think you're doing fighting Mahawk? Are you that eager to die? Luffy said, pissing Zoro off. What is that supposed to mean? Zoro asked angrily. Are you saying I can't beat him? He yelled out. Luffy, who still had his back towards him, spoke in an emotionless tone. That is exactly what I am saying, Luffy said, surprising the chefs there. You have no idea just how big the ocean is and just how small a fish you are in that ocean, not even I can beat him. Yet, Luffy stated, still not looking at his swordsman. Are you sure you want to do this? I promised, I would not go in the way of your dream. Luffy asked. Zoro looked at him for a while before nodding. I'm sure, he said before he leapt off of the restaurant and landed on a large piece of the ship that broke off. Luffy sighed and looked towards Mahawk before he spoke. I want him back alive, Mahawk-sensei, Luffy said with a sigh. Mahawk looked at Zoro for a while before he turned and looked towards Luffy and spoke with a light chuckle. I'll try, he said, causing Luffy to close his fist. His skin turned black from hockey. Zoro walked in front of the warlord. Dracul Mihawk, I have sailed, I have trained for years, with a single motivation, one day to fight and defeat you. Zoro stated right in front of Mihawk, who didn't look impressed. The opposite, he looked bored, as if Zoro was a small ant claiming that he would slain a dragon. Luffy-kun was right. You have no idea just how big this world is and just how little a fish you are in this world, Mihawk said. Zoro clenched his teeth in anger. If you're half the swordsman that you claim that you are, you should be able to see the difference between us. What is making you fight me? It is stupidity or arrogance. Neither, Zoro replied, clutching Wado Ikimonji between his teeth and his other two unnamed swords in his hands. My desire to be the strongest swordsman, and a vow that I made to a dear friend that passed away. To be honest, I didn't expect to face you so soon. This is not lucky for you, he said before removing his necklace, and then grabbing a small knife. The knife was very small, one would use it to cut small pieces of meat. And what exactly do you intend to do with it? Zoro's eyes furrowed as he saw Mihawk's lack of concern. I'm not the type of brute who would use a cannon to kill an ant. Even if you're the best swordman in East Blue, this is still the East Blue, the weakest of the seas. Mihawk had a firm grasp on the teeny tiny knife. But please accept my apologies. Unfortunately, I don't have any blades that are smaller than this. Zoro rushed towards Mihawk. As Luffy expected, Zoro didn't stood a chance. At first Mihawk was only playing with him before getting a bit more serious, resulting in Zoro getting a wound. Luffy still tried to keep his cool, but was failing by the second, as his hand were causing lightning. Nami's eyes welled up with tears as she saw her nakama being stabbed. Sanji was clenching the cigarette between his teeth. Despite not liking the idiot, he knew Zoro's journey shouldn't stop here, in East Blue. Do you want me to stab your heart? Why don't you give up? Mihawk questioned the younger swordsman. His knife was buried in his chest, but Zoro refused to back down. Who knows? Zoro said panting, more blood dropping from his chin. I know that I made a vow. If we're to back down, then I refuse to be a swordsman. I won't go in the afterlife with regrets. When I see her again I want to smile instead of dropping my head in shame. My words means more than my life, Zoro claimed. That is called defeat, Mihawk answered by locking his eyes with Zoro's. That's why I can't take a step back. Even if it meant your death. Mihawk asked, still keeping his eye contact with the other swordsman. It'd be better if I died. Zoro said sternly. If I just run away like a dog with my tails between my legs, that would be humiliating. I would never be able to look at myself in a mirror again. That's a true swordsman. Mihawk noticed this as he took a step back and slipped his knife out of Zoro's chest, swinging it to remove all of the blood. As he sheathed the kogatana, he finished the cross on his necklace. Swordsman, tell me your name. Roronoa. Zoro. Zoro positioned his swords at right angles to one another. Like a three-pointed star, they all pointed in opposite directions. I'll keep that in mind. As he reached behind his shoulder and yanked Yuru, generally considered as the greatest blade in the world, off his back, Mihawk exclaimed. Because your power is seldom seen in this world. And to show my appreciation for your swordsmanship and commitment, I'll finish you with this sword. This is it, Zoro pondered carefully. Thank you very much. He thought of his first meeting with Kuina, his first meeting with his captain and the greedy witch, a smile on his face at the memory. This is it, Kuina, our dream fulfilled or I will die. Both attacked. Mihawk was taken by surprise from the added haki in Zoro's last attack. Nothing happened for a second, before two of Zoro's swords broke like glass before a wound showed in his chest. Zoro spit out blood, dropping the worthless blades in the water. Gripping his treasured sword from his teeth, he turned at Mihawk. I lost, I'm sorry Kuina. Zoro spread out his arms right in front of Mihawk, gripping his valuable sword on his hand. What is this? Mihawk questioned, confused. A wound in the back. It's the humiliation of a swordsman. Zoro stated smiling as blood poured out of his mouth. Excellent. Mihawk shouted, a broad smile on his face. He cut Zoro from his left collarbone to his right hip bone, slicing him open. Don't rush to death, young swordsman. Sinking in the sea, he gripped his treasured sword on his hand, not wanting to let go. Zoro! They yelled as they jumped into the water to save Zoro. Luffy turned to Lightning, showing up right in front of Mihawk, but this time his arms were black with armament haki. Mihawk smirked, knowing where this was going. It had been a year after all. Luffy! Zoro yelled out, getting everyone's attention, especially Luffy and Mihawk. Luffy looked over to Zoro to see him laying on his back with one hand holding the only sword he had left in the air. Luffy, can you hear me? Zoro asked in a shaky voice. Shut up, you moron. Don't talk, Nami shouted at him, still crying. Yeah, I hear you, Luffy said. Zoro took a breath before he began to speak again. Sorry for worrying you, Zoro said, causing Luffy to smile. If I don't become the greatest swordsman in the world, you'd be in a dilemma now, right? He said before he coughed up some blood, causing the bounty hunter duo to yell at him to stop and save his energy, which Zoro ignored and continued to speak instead. I will never lose again, Zoro yelled out with tears streaming down his face. Until I defeat him and become the world's greatest swordsman, I'll never be defeated anymore. As Zoro said that, Mihawk and Luffy's face split into a wide grin after hearing what Zoro said. Do you have a problem with that? Pirate King! Zoro yelled. Luffy chuckled to himself before he replied. Not a single problem, Luffy said. Luffy then turned to Mihawk and saw him standing there with his arms folded and his sword already strapped to his back. Luffy was about to speak to him, but Mihawk looks in his direction and spoke first. It is still too early for you to die. My name is Hawkeye Mihawk. You are strong, but there is still much for you to learn. No matter how many years it takes, I will hold this title as the greatest in the world and wait for you. Until that day you must hone your skills then. Seek me out, Roronoa Zoro. Hawkeye said, surprising everyone there, including Luffy. Knowing Zoro would live, Luffy turned to look at Mihawk. He looked back at Luffy, knowing what would happen. One swing. One swing, Luffy replied. His crewmates were confused, but Nami understood where this was going. Luffy, don't even think about it. He's strong, Nami shouted at her lover. She knew her captain was powerful, but Mihawk looked at on a completely different level. Don't worry, Nami, I won't get hurt, Luffy replied, trying to ease her worries. As he put his hands together, the electricity around his arms and hand became more apparent. Zoro, who was still awake, looked at his captain with interest. What happened next shocked everyone except Mihawk. Luffy started moving his left hand away from his right hand, creating a lightning sword on his right hand, which at first looked like lightning shaped like a sword. Still, the lightning started accumulating, before much to the surprise of everyone turned into a real sword. Completely physical, not like lightning anymore, handle, blade and all. Zoro could feel power itself coming from the sword. The pommel was green, the guard of the sword was red in color, the blade looked clean and beautiful. So you can finally use, Inazuma, smirking, he pulled out his sword. Luffy clenched his teeth. The sword took a lot from him, got him tired too quickly. Yes, let's see who is the better swordsman, Luffy stated, his arms black taking a stance, Mihawk doing the exact preparing, but not using armament haki. Everyone was waiting with bated breath. What would happen? Nami prayed Luffy would survive this. Both suddenly rushed at each other, their sword made contact. The moment they made contact, electricity spread all around them, causing harsh winds to spread everywhere and white electricity to spread around. As the sea itself was moving around, waves after waves, creating a storm. Luffy was pushing back against Mihawk, but Hawkeye's sword wasn't moving, not even an inch. Luffy let out a cry, adding all his strength to the swing, causing boards of Going Merry and Baratie to start cracking. The chefs started losing consciousness, everyone fell in the floor. The only one left still standing was Zeph, Nami, Zoro, Sanji. Usopp had lost his consciousness. Nami could hardly keep herself from falling asleep. She couldn't understand why her captain was suddenly using Conqueror's haki. Mihawk turned his arms black, countering the newly added strength from Luffy. The pirate captain grinned in victory. This was the first time Mihawk used armament haki against him. Such power in a single swing of their swords, Zeph whispered as he stared at Luffy and Mihawk as they squared off in the middle of everyone. Sanji, who also had his eyes widen at the sheer power of the two men, couldn't believe what he was seeing. Are they even human? Sanji asked out loud. Zeph scoffed and folded his arms before he replied. That's what exists in the Grand Line. Nami was silently praying, seeing that Mihawk was winning. You have gotten stronger, Luffy, Mihawk complimented before adding strength, pushing Luffy's sword slightly away. Not strong enough, fully overpowering Luffy, sending him flying to the open sea. Luffy, everyone shouted, worried. Nami was about to jump in the water, but Luffy turned into lightning, showing up right in front of his crew, breathing heavily. Zoro was shocked at his display of power. He had never seen Luffy like that, now understanding why Luffy was trying so hard to make sure they were strong. Compared to him, he was nothing. Zoro clenched his teeth. I won't shame you, Luffy, I will train 10 times harder from now on, he thought. Nami rushed at Luffy, seeing he was fine, kissing his lips much to the displeasure of Sanji, who bit down at his cigarette. Luffy looked well, except for a cut on his stomach but nothing life-threatening. She wanted to shout at him for being so stupid but decided to do that when they were in private. You did well, Luffy-kun. I still remember your promise, Mihawk stated. Luffy grinned, knowing Mihawk still remembered it. So do I. Later. Luffy and his crew were in going merry, saying goodbye to the chefs. I entrust Sanji with you, don't let him close to any woman, Zeph shouted, causing many to laugh. Sanji moved in front of the ship, looking at his old home with sadness, tears developing in his eyes before he kneeled in front of them. Father Zeph, thank you for all these years, you were always like a father to me. And I promise I will fulfill our dream for both of us. Next time we see each other, we will be talking about All Blue, Sanji shouted, tears streaming down his face. The chefs, even Patty, were crying, saying goodbye to him. I know you will, Zeph shouted as the ship sailed away, the sun illuminating the sea. Good luck my son. Luffy. They had left Baratie, and Usopp had taken Sanji on a tour of the ship, including the kitchen, his bedroom, and everything else. Luffy and Nami were on the main deck, they were looking at the map together, and Johnny and Yosaku were looking at them with concern. Zoro was resting, despite the fact that he had been trying to train. Nami had strictly forbidden him to train, and so had Luffy. Even though the captain of the Straw Hats Pirates didn't know much about medicine, he recognized that someone with a wound like his shouldn't really train. He walked up to her and wrapped his arm around her waist. Nami felt better with his arm around her and rested her head against Luffy's chest. They had just set their course for her village, Kokoyashi. After all this time, it was time for Arlong to receive his reward. The mere thought of him sent a shiver down her spine, but it was not out of fear. Instead, she was excited to see what would happen to him. He would suffer for every bit of suffering he had caused her village. Luffy big bro, I was under the impression that we were going to Grand Line. When Yosaku inquired, his voice trembled as he realized where the ship was headed. As Luffy's voice remained firm and unmoving throughout, he stated, yes, we are, but, first, we have a business in the Konami Islands. Zoro had no idea what was going on, but if his captain was talking like that, he knew two things. First, no one could make him change his mind. Second, his captain had been pissed off by someone. Is not a safe place, big bro Luffy. Are you familiar with the name Arlong? Is his empire, and not even Don Krieg had the courage to attack the Konami Islands because of Arlong, not to mention Jinbei, the warlord. Luffy narrowed his eyes as Johnny explained what he was talking about. Their explanation continued, stating that Arlong had been freed as a result of Jinbei making a pact with the Marine. Jinbei was now a warlord, and Arlong was no longer a prisoner in Impel Down. Luffy made a mental note to one day confront Jinbei about his decision to free Arlong and allow him to roam freely around the world. Jinbei should have been aware of Arlong's anti-human sentiments, so if the two ever crossed paths, Luffy would require a compelling explanation from him. After Johnny and Yosaku had finished explaining why they should not travel to the Konami Islands, Luffy raised his left hand and demanded that they remain silent. The Konami Islands are where Nami's home is, Luffy stated simply. The two swordsmen gasped and looked at Nami with pity, while she looked in the direction the ship was traveling, waiting for the sight of her home on the horizon to appear. Throughout the years, Arlong has terrorized her family and even murdered her mother. Anyone who gets in a fight with my crew will not get away with it. I've already stated that I'm going to kill him, and no one can make me change my mind. Luffy said this while looking at the two swordsmen, who both nodded in agreement as they realized what was going on. Considering how much Nami must have suffered, they would not even attempt to persuade him otherwise. Nami's face lit up with a smile like a fire, and her face brightened up like the sun before she grabbed Luffy's head and pushed it downwards towards the valley of her breasts. Luffy grinned as he enjoyed the smooth skin of her breasts, Nami resting her cheek on the brim of his hat, and Luffy grinned even wider. Thank you very much, Luffy, she said it softly, her heart pounding against her chest. Soon, her village would be free, and she would be able to free herself, her home, and her sister from slavery. You're my Nakama Nami. I would go through hell for any of you, Luffy said again, and Nami pressed his face deeper into her chest. Then, with a smile on his face, he took Nami into his arms and carried her like a princess. Shitty captain, why is the world so cruel? A small river of tears flowed down the sides of the ship as Sanji cried out to the gods. Zoro rolled his eyes at the pervert, and Usopp felt sorry for him while simultaneously hoping that they would be prepared to fight someone like Arlong. During dinner, Luffy explained to Sanji the workout they did every day, and how, now that he was a Nakama, he would have to train as well. Sanji had no objections to this and agreed to participate. Night. An unexpected knock on the door interrupted Luffy's preparations for bed. Luffy smiled, realizing it was Nami on the other side. Nami had slept in his room a couple of times since the night they spent together, but they hadn't gotten any further than making out and touching each other's bodies, which was the extent of their intimacy. As soon as Luffy opened the door, Nami appeared in the doorway. He smiled at her, but noticed something different. Her eyes were almost completely black, looking at him with desire and lust, and Luffy noticed she was only wearing a bikini, with the button barely keeping her breasts hidden. She was almost completely naked. Luffy, do you mind if I come in? Nami inquired, her voice hushed and seductive. Luffy seemed to enjoy her voice, stepping aside as Nami walked into the room before closing the door behind her. He turned around, but his attention was drawn to Nami, who was removing her blue bra, exposing her large breasts. He couldn't stop himself from staring. Luffy couldn't keep his eyes away from her breasts, her pink nipples. Nami giggles at his reaction before slowly approaching Luffy, almost like a hunter at the prey. Luffy, she said the name with lust before kissing her lover. Lemon. Her lips were so soft, and she thought he was a pretty good kisser. Their tongues began wrestling with each other. This is gonna be fun. The orange woman thought as she reached down between her legs and her hand met the bulge in his pants and she started to slide her hands slowly on both sides on Luffy's member, allowing him to take off his shirt and toss it away. Nami unzipped Luffy's pants and his erect member immediately jutted out his pants and Nami broke the kiss to lick her lips at the sight of it as Luffy took off his pants and slid them to the floor and the orange-eyed woman then wrapped her legs around his waist, sandwiching his member between them and he then cupped the ample breasts and he froze as he heard her moan before he lowered his crotch underneath Nami's and swiftly sandwiched his member between her ass. Luffy-kun, what are you going to? Nami started to say before Luffy started to thrust his hardened cock between her ass cheeks and she moaned while Luffy lay on his back and continued to squeeze her breasts and rub them together. Oh yes, Luffy. Yes. Just warming up. Luffy said in a husky voice as the soft flesh of Nami's ass smothered his manhood as she moaned at the hardness of his manhood and she began to grind her ass on his member as he kneaded the soft mounds while pressing his fingers into the undersides of her breasts. Nami blushed and continued to grind her rear entrance with her pussy wetting as a result. Nami wrenched her ass around Luffy's member that stimulated his manhood, and the two moaned as Luffy fondled her breasts and pressed his palms into the softness of the orbs and he noticed her now wet entrance and an almost cruel look appeared on his face as he released one of Nami's tits and slowly entered two fingers into her heat-filled entrance and he sat up and kissed her again and they started dueling tongues. With her mouth, her pussy, and her ass all occupied by Luffy, she was glad that he knew how to pleasure her so well and she complied by still working her hips. She's so warm. Luffy thought as he thrust his cock between her ass cheeks and his fingers wriggled inside her moist womanhood, and she broke the kiss to moan as she placed her head over his shoulder, and his teasing continued when he started skimming his lips on her neck to leave faint kisses on her. Yes, Luffy, please don't stop. Nami still worked her ass cheeks on Luffy's member with them sliding up and down his hardened manhood, and he worked his sandwiched cock between them while he wriggled his fingers inside her warmth. Luffy brought his lips to Nami's collarbone and started gnawing at it while still groping her breast and fingering her heated insides while she wrapped her arms around him and held onto him tightly as he continued to thrust between her ass cheeks that kept his member erect and at full strength while he carried on with his fingering of her pussy. Yes, Luffy, right there, don't stop, she moaned, feeling bliss like never before. Finally Luffy had stopped waiting. Nami moaned as she started kissing the back of Luffy's neck while his fingers dug into her lower tunnels, and he soon brought his lips to her neck, where he began a new series of nibbling that was intent on giving her a hickey. The orange female's womanhood soaked Luffy's fingers as he wriggled them inside of her wetness, and she held Luffy's head between her breasts before he started licking the middle of her chest with his other hand snaking around her lower back to grip her ass, allowing him to grope it. Luffy's fingers fingered deeply into Nami's wet core, and she whimpered as she felt herself close to coming, but she could tell that the dark-haired male was about to do the same since his cock was twitching between her ass cheeks. Nami still worked her plump ass around Luffy's member and he still nibbled his teeth on her neck, before kissing her nipple, his tongue licking it, before he sucked on it. Luffy had never tested something as delicious as her Nami's breast, sucking more causing her to moan. She grabbed his hair and pushing him deeper into her breasts. Yes, yes Luffy, suck them, please, oh. She moaned, feeling she was in heaven. Soon, she moaned as she came on Luffy's fingers and her juices came streaming down his hand, and he released himself 1 second later as he came with the head of his member sandwiched between Nami's ass, and that only added more reason for her to moan as she felt the heavy impact of his cock unleashing itself. Cum splatted inside Nami's ass and she fell forward onto Luffy as she rested her head on his chest while he brought his fluid-soaked hand to his mouth and cleaned it off with his tongue. Nami Haim, you taste so delicious. Luffy complimented the orange female before he kissed her, and she held her head against his chest while semen dripped from between her ass down onto his lap while some of his cum still emerged from his cock. Now, it's your turn, Luffy-kun. Nami seductively purred, and the two were in front of the bed next with Luffy standing up in front of her while she knelt down in front of him. The dark-haired male gestured at Nami, and she replied by smiling while she gripped Luffy's cock to start jerking him off while she held his balls in her other hand and toyed with them. Nami stroked the manhood in her hand with Luffy standing perfectly still while she marveled at how hard it felt, though it being hard was not much due to her still knowing how it felt when it came between her ass cheeks. Keeping that in mind, Nami continued to stroke his member while trickling her fingers through his ballsack in her hand before she brought her face closer to it, allowing her to take it into her mouth while Luffy shivered at how warm her mouth felt as she licked the front of his member as he gently placed his hand on her head and thrust into her mouth carefully. Nami's mouth remained as it was while she sucked on Luffy's member as he sent his swollen length into her oral entrance while the hot saliva soaked his cock and the warmth of it kept his member strong and stimulated. Nami kept on sucking. The deeper she got, the more addicted she felt with the taste, her tongue touching the tip, stimulating him. Luffy felt in heaven before he thrusted into her mouth, much to Nami's delight, the whole cock almost in her mouth. She didn't gag. As Luffy started fucking her face, gripping her head, Nami felt the cock on her throat. She liked being used like this by Luffy, before Luffy released her head. Nami released his cock from her mouth with a loud pop, sending Luffy a lustful look. Nami then did something unexpected by cupping her breasts and wrapping them around Luffy's hilt, making him groan at how soft the mounds of flesh felt on his cock while he thrust into them. The orange female smirked at this while Luffy began thrust into the breasts that held his cock within them as the erect nipples rubbed the veins of the manhood. Luffy took his hand off Nami's head and focused more on his thrusts into the soft orbs while they massaged his manhood, and Nami's mouth made the thrusts more worth it. Nami held her breasts together on the dark-haired male's length as she rubbed the orbs together on it before she took her mouth of it to blow on it, the air from her cool breath hitting Luffy's saliva-covered cock and making him shiver as a result. Nami began to lick the head of Luffy's cock while his hilt thrust between her cleavage that rubbed on it, and Luffy groaned as the woman smirked while keeping her eyes focused on his cock. The feeling of the soft breasts drove Luffy crazy as he helped Nami hold the large mounds together as he pounded his throbbing through the mounds of flesh that held his member inside while the hardened nipples pleasured the muscular veins they surrounded. Nami's warm tongue licked the very top of Luffy's manhood as he groped her breasts while still assisting her in holding them together on his length as he guided it through the cleavage with the orbs constantly bouncing on his length as it jetted through her large tits while she licked the head of it to keep it stimulated. Luffy groaned as Nami's mouth took his cock in, and he again shivered at how warm her mouth was on the inside as he carefully thrust into her oral entrance while she sucked on his every movement while still making her breasts bounce on his member to tease it. Nami's tongue twirled around Luffy's length until he groaned as her entire mouth took in as much of his cock as possible while he released his semen inside her mouth. Luffy's cum splattered all over the inside of Nami's mouth, and she let out a muffled moan as she swallowed some of the semen before taking her mouth off of it and some cum trailed down his cock and into the deep cleavage that held it. Luffy's face broke into pure joy as his cum trailed into Nami's breasts and she once again licked the head of it before removing her breasts off it and standing up. The next minute, the two sat on the bed making out before Nami made Luffy lay back and she stood up to stand in front of him while facing away from him. She looked back to nod and smile at Luffy while he returned the gesture and she took a deep breath before sitting on his lap. I will go slow, Nami. I don't want to hurt you, Luffy spoke preparing to thrust inside her wet pussy. Nami smiled sweetly at her captain. She loved how careful he could be. But she wasn't as delicate as glass, she wanted him to fuck her, without mercy. Don't worry, Luffy. I know this, I came here knowing and wanting this from you, Luffy spoke before kissing his lips. Taking his erection into her womanhood and taking her virginity as a result. Nami panted lustfully at how hard Luffy felt inside of her before she worked her hips to grind his hard length inside of her body. Luffy moaned as he thrust into the warm's walls that his cock rubbed against and Nami moaned while resting her ass on his lap to grind his cock inside her thoroughly as it was sent thundering into her pussy. Yes, fuck me Luffy. Fuck me, she moaned feeling complete. Nami whimpered as Luffy slammed his powerful manhood into her moist womanhood and he moaned at how warm she felt on the inside while she did likewise with how his cock was on the inside. The captain moaned as Nami grinded his cock that jerked into her and she moaned while her large breasts heaved each time she rode his slamming length. Nami's orange eyes started filling with lust and she blushed heavily as Luffy pounded into the warm walls of flesh that smothered his member warmly. Nami's plump ass smacked against Luffy's lap as his cock jetted into her core to keep her aroused and working her hips to grind the member pummeling into her hot walls. Luffy moaned loudly before he reached up and gripped Nami's waist while he thrust his cock forth into her wet womanhood that felt so tight on his length with his hands holding onto her sides before they moved to her stomach to make circles around it before finally moving his hands upward to try and cup her large breasts. Luffy growled huskily as he cupped the breasts and started to caress them in his palms while Nami still rode her lover's length in complete tandem with his movements with his thrusts penetrating her womanhood as it was slammed into with his ballsack heaving as well. Nami moaned and then fell back, her back on Luffy's chest with his cock still buried deep inside of her. Luffy rubbed Nami's tits together and he loved how warm and tender they felt in his palms while the orange-eyed woman bucked her hips in response to all of this. Nami gripped the sheets of the bed and held onto them tightly as Luffy's cock crashed into her tightening womanhood that grinded it and Luffy was not sure as to what part of her felt better, her breasts or the plump ass that was slapping against his lap. Yes, Luffy fuck yes, Luffy. Make me your whore, she moaned, completely lost to the amount of pleasure. Luffy placed his lips on Nami's and the two lovers kissed as the orange-eyed woman landed her ass on his lap while their tongues met to do battle with each other. Nami spread her legs wider and still bucked her hips as she moaned into Luffy's mouth with his manhood slamming into her core, her breasts bouncing together in Luffy's palms as he made his crotch smacked into her ass. Nami's arousal soared high as Luffy's length thrust straight into her pussy and slammed his cock into the warmth that kept him both stimulated and motivated. Luffy and Nami still made their tongues battle as he thrust into her one final time and she separated lips to moan, "Yes fuck," as loud as she could as her womanhood clamped down on his manhood, making him growl as he unleashed his white, creamy seed inside of her. The two lovers moaned as they released before they starting to pant as they lay their sweaty bodies still before Nami's inner juices and Luffy's semen came streaming out of her womanhood before she got off him and lay next to him to kiss his cheek the next moment. This was amazing Luffy, you really were amazing, Nami said, her index finger circling his chest. I'm glad. I was a bit worried that I wouldn't be able to please you, Luffy said before wrapping his arms around her waist. Want some more? Nami asked after she noticed Luffy's still erect member. Yes, Nami. Nami lifted her right leg and placed it around Luffy's waist so he could help her lift her other leg, locking them around his waist to allow him to grip her ass. Nami then lifted herself a little and sank her womanhood down Luffy's length. He then began to restart his thrusts as Nami bucked her hips once more as her lover held onto her ass for a perfect balance. Nami moaned and pressed her jiggling breasts against Luffy's chest as she held onto him tightly while bucking her hips in sync with his thrusts as he rammed his manhood into his lover as she placed her head over his shoulder and started nibbling onto his neck while he sent his cock into her warmth as he groped her ass that he also used to help balance her on his erect member. Luffy kissed the back of his lover's neck as he carried on with pounding his stiff length into the orange femmel's tight womanhood along with the endless groping of her ass that smacked on his crotch. Nami moaned as she felt Luffy's throbbing length pound deeply against her inner tunnels and the pleasure it gave her was only a motivation to keep her long legs wrapped around his waist. The pair moaned in bliss while they held onto each other. You sure like my ass, don't you, Luffy-kun? Nami asked. Oh, yeah. I have something in store for it after this. Luffy moaned in response and Nami smiled in response as she figured whatever her captain had in store for her ass had to be something she would surely enjoy. Luffy pounded through Nami's folds and made her whimper while she felt his tongue licking the back of her neck while still nibbling on his neck as well. Nami's breasts rubbed against Luffy's chest, and he enjoyed the feeling of the soft orbs jiggling against his chest and he starting nibbling the same area he finished licking, leaving a hickey on her neck. The orange woman bucked her hips in unison with Luffy's thrust, and she finally left a hickey on his neck as he had just done before they faced each other. Bright cerulean eyes gazing into dark green ones as the two locked lips once again. Luffy and Nami's tongues reprised their dueling for dominance while the male dark-haired felt his lover's ass smack against his lap as his cock slammed into her wetness. Nami's blush remained on her face as Luffy rammed his cock into her and her large breasts jiggled against his chest as they smother it in return and the two lovers kissed while their heat-seeking tongues scanned each other's mouth. Luffy and Nami groaned as they came with they separated lips to grit their teeth as the orange woman's insides coiled around the erection it held inside, taking in yet another splash of semen inside of it. Nami whimpered as she felt the cum pour out of her and drip to the floor while Luffy panted from how good the sex felt while he lowered himself to allow his lover to unwrap her legs from around his waist. Nami lay on her back on the floor panting with a pleased smile on her face while Luffy sat next to her with his erection as it was. So, Luffy-kun? Nami asked. Yeah, Nami-hime. Luffy said as he smiled down at her. What do you have in store for my ass? Nami said as she sat up. I was thinking of letting you have it in there. If you want, that is. Luffy said and Nami smirked at this. I love it. Nami said. Really? Yeah, come on. Nami said and Luffy smiled in response as he got behind her and gripped her elbows. Luffy sighed as he placed his cock between Nami's ass cheeks and rubbed it against her anus like he done before. Nami bit her lower lip as Luffy rubbed his cock between her ass cheeks before he took in a deep breath and slid his member into her ass, his cock almost vanishing into her rear completely. Nami moaned loudly in pain before Luffy groaned at how tight her ass felt and he let out a husky growl before he began to pound into her. Her ass started to constrict around his member as he plunged into her and the orange navigator moaned as her body shivered in pleasure as Luffy's cock slammed into her ass that clapped together on his member as it drove into her. Luffy closed his eyes and smiled in pure bliss about how Nami's tight rear felt as he pounded into it while he held onto her elbows and her body followed his every thrust as her breasts swayed over the floor. Nami's face formed into true lust as her eyes halfway turned white and the blush she had took up most of her face as she moaned from how strong Luffy felt on the inside of her rear while she pitted her hips against his and the male dark-haired smiled at how warm and tight his lover's ass turned out to be. Nami's womanhood turned wet from Luffy's thrust slamming into her rear as its owner pummeled it down her rectum before he let go of her elbows and gripped her stomach for a while to slide his right hand upward to her swaying breasts to try and cup them while his other hand fingered her womanhood. Luffy smiled at how erratic Nami's breathing turned from her extra arousal sources being touched as she was still somewhat hunched over as the male dark-haired his cock into her clapping ass cheek and he moaned in delight on the rear mounds clapped on his member. Nami thought Luffy's member in her ass felt good as she versed her hips against his in a battling of speed that had the same outcome, his cock pounding into her ass. Luffy fingered into Nami's pussy that still wet from their recent sex and growled as he caressed her heaving mound of flesh that jiggled in his palm while she started caressing her free mound. Nami still shivered at Luffy's cock hitting into her ass while her pussy turned wet from his fingering the fondling of her breasts, and they both moaned with the male dark-haired fondling the navigator's breast and dug his fingers into her warmth that was turning wetter from Luffy's length pummeling into her ass. Luffy let out a husky growl at the plump rear clapping together on his length as he sent it ramming into her rectum, and Nami moaned as she felt herself almost ready to come. Luffy sensed this and continued ramming his cock into Nami's ass while they versed hips that the latter gave up on, with the dark-eyed dark-haired being the victor as he groaned with her before he came into her ass while burying his whole member inside it and made her release her inner fluids a second after that. Oh fuck yes. Nami whimpered as she came, and she swore she saw stars burst out of nowhere in front of her face as she panted from how warm the combined cum felt as it began to drip out of her rear and pussy. Luffy panted before letting go of Nami before removing his soaked cock out of her body while she slowly dropped to her knees and lay on her side with a look of bliss on her face before she smiled at her lover and he did the same. Nami sat up to lick Luffy's cock clean of the semen before he picked her up and carried her to bed, and the two lay there. Nami looked at his eyes. She kissed him deeply as Luffy returned the kiss. She felt his member was hard again, before she started riding his cock. That night they did 2 more times before Nami fell asleep tired, but she noticed that Luffy could have gone a few more rounds. We might need to have another woman soon. Somewhere. Baru 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 baru, stopped after someone responded to the transponder snail. Drake, is it done? Almost done, Lord Admiral. We are waiting for new orders. Good. Does he have doubts? No, Lord Admiral, only one photo of the poneglyph and he agreed. Good. Make sure to keep the original and remember, 4,514 feet. I'd want to talk with Genzo. Genzo confidently strode towards the Marine captain with a rugged face adorned with scars. Clad in a distinctive brown police uniform, the short sleeves and matching shorts were a testament to his practicality and adaptability. Every piece of his attire, save for the pinwheel on a pole affixed to his hat, had once belonged to the notorious pirate Arlong. As he approached the captain, his voice steady and respectful. That'd be me, Genzo declared, his gaze meeting the captain's. How may I assist you, Captain? With a mischievous twinkle in her eyes and a sly grin spreading across her face, Nezumi confidently posed a question. Excuse me, dear town folk, but would you happen to know a young woman by the name of Nami? She lives here, right? The villagers couldn't help but exchange wary glances, their expressions a blend of skepticism and concern. With a stoic expression adorning his face, Nami is not here, she hasn't been seen here for a while. As the words escaped his lips, his face showed no emotions. Such a shame, Nezumi said. But I believe she has a sister, Nojiko, right? That's true, Genzo said. Then lead the way, Mr. Genzo, Nezumi said with a mischievous glint in his eyes as he observed Genzo's confident demeanor and the way he effortlessly turned on his heels, striding purposefully away from the bustling docks and towards the heart of the island. Nezumi followed closely. As they strolled at a leisurely pace, the sun cast its golden rays upon the quaint settlement of Kokoyashi, illuminating the vibrant colors of the houses and the intricate details of the narrow streets. Nezumi's sharp gaze scanned the surroundings, his keen senses attuned to the subtle shifts in the residents' expressions, noting their surreptitious glances and guarded whispers hinting at hidden secrets. Their journey came to a pause as they arrived upon a seemingly unremarkable dwelling nestled amidst the picturesque landscape. Its weathered wooden walls bore the marks of time, while a gentle breeze rustled through the leaves of a sizable grove of mikan trees, their luscious fruits hanging like bursts of sunshine against the emerald foliage. Genzo gently rapped his knuckles against the wooden door, the sound echoing through the air, only to be met with the presence of a young lady. A cascade of light blue hair and captivating dark blue eyes accompanied her radiant smile. As his gaze traveled down her slender frame, he couldn't help but notice the intricate tapestry of ink that adorned her right arm, its artistic patterns flowing gracefully. The tattoos meandered up her arm, playfully crossing over her shoulder and gracefully curving onto her breast, forming a delicate heart-shaped masterpiece. Complementing her vivid display of art, she was adorned in a pair of vibrant green slacks that accentuated her figure, paired with a simple yet elegant white tank top. Genzo, who are these people? Nojiko said, looking at the marine captain with narrowed eyes. With an air of confidence, Captain Nezumi stepped closer to her, his voice resonating with a hint of mischief as he introduced himself. My name is Captain Nezumi. His piercing gaze traveled appreciatively up and down her figure, causing her to involuntarily recoil, an uncomfortable shiver coursing through her spine. Despite her obvious discomfort, his smile seemed to widen, revealing a mischievous glint in his eyes. I came here to have a conversation with your sister, Nami, he continued, his tone laced with disappointment. However, she seems to not be here, so you will do just fine. About what? Captain. With a growing grin, Nezumi remarked, you won't like what I'm about to say, we have proof that your sister is a thief. I don't understand what you are talking about, we haven't seen Nami for a very long time, Nojiko said. You are a bad liar, Nezumi said, grinning. But you are lucky, no one here will be injured, after all your sister stole from pirates, the things they had were stolen things after all. You won't face any charges, but you understand that we as Marine are bounded by law to help people, those things will be returned back to their rightful owners. You bastard. Nojiko clenched her teeth, her hands turning to fists. As the command to search the home echoed through the air, a courageous Marine stepped forward and advanced towards the door. As the Marine crossed the threshold, but before he could do anything, his world was turned upside down with a thunderous blow from Genzo. The impact was so powerful that it reverberated through the room. Instantly, pain surged through the Marine's body, his vision blurring as he clutched his now bleeding nose. As the Marine crumpled to the ground, his broken nose bled heavily. Genzo said angrily, the Arlong pirates have been enslaving the population for a long time, yet you come here and do nothing about it. You just attacked a Marine soldier. You are a criminal, be careful what you say. You are lucky I'm feeling merciful today, the Marine captain said with a growing smirk before turning to face his soldiers. What are you waiting for? Search the house. People have been begging for Marine to help them for a decade, yet you come here and try to ruin all the hope we have. Genzo exclaimed as he took a step forward. They were not but insignificant refuse, unworthy of his mercy. Meanwhile, the Marines swiftly locked their sights on their adversaries, their guns poised and primed. What's taking so long? We are not looking for a needle in a haystack. How hard can it be to find 100 million berries? Genzo shouted at his soldiers. How do you know how much money is missing? Nojiko's words trailed as her eyes widened, now understanding what was happening. The bastard. Genzo grumbled, knowing the Marine worked for Arlong. You work for Arlong, this is why you know to look for 100 million berries, you bastards. Nojiko shouted with fury, trying to fight, but Genzo held her back, knowing it wouldn't achieve anything. We found them, sir. Thank you for the money. Tell Nami to keep on working, Nezumi said with a wide grin as he and his soldiers walked away with the money, many of them already planning on how to use the money. Tomorrow. As Going Merry finally reached Nami's island, the crew was ready to take on Arlong and his crew, especially Sanji, who couldn't stop speaking nonsense. Luffy suddenly felt something as they approached, his eyes widened, knowing why he was having this feeling, and a grin spread on his face, wondering just what kind of power it had. As they made their way towards Nami's house, the sun cast a warm glow upon the navigator's face, reflecting the hope that awaited them. However, a gasp escaped the navigator's lips, her eyes morphing into pools of sheer horror as they landed upon the sight that unfolded before her. The once sturdy door of her beloved sanctuary lay shattered into countless pieces. Caught off guard by Nami's sudden distress, Luffy, with genuine concern etched across his countenance, inquired, "What's wrong, Nami?" Without a moment's hesitation, her heart pounding with an unstoppable force, Nami's nimble feet propelled her forward, her voice piercing through the air as she shouted Nojiko's name. Nojiko. Are you here? Nami's voice echoed through the quiet corridors of the house, filled with a tinge of concern and worry. As she cautiously stepped over the threshold, the atmosphere seemed to change, heavy with sorrow. And there, Nami's eyes landed on Nojiko, crumpled on the cold ground, her delicate form trembling as tears cascaded down her distraught face, leaving a trail of despair on the worn wooden floor. Overwhelmed with a mixture of relief and anguish, Nami rushed forward, her footsteps quickening, closing the distance between them in an instant. Nojiko. Thank God you are all right. She exclaimed, her voice laced with immense gratitude and a touch of disbelief. The weight of worry that had been crushing her chest suddenly lifted as she enveloped her sister in a tight, comforting embrace. The sobs that racked Nojiko's body echoed in the room as she sought solace against Nami's shoulder. I'm sorry, Nami, but I couldn't do anything to stop them, Nojiko cried out as more tears rolled down her face. Nami looked confused as she backed away a little from Nojiko. Stop who? The Marines, they came here and took all the money, Nami. All the money you saved. Nojiko cried out, her voice cracking. Her words caused Nami to be a little surprised that her sister seemed to have known about what she had been doing. Don't cry, Nojiko, we don't need the money anymore. My crew will take care of Arlong and his crew, Nami claimed with a bright smile as she pointed towards a group of strangers. Huh. Nojiko couldn't help but look at her sister in confusion before looking at the strangers. With one glance, she could tell they were pirates, especially the one with the straw hat. Do not worry, Lady Nojiko, we will take care of Arlong. Just point us in the right direction, Luffy claimed with a wide grin. Nojiko opened and closed her mouth several times before looking at her sister as if to say, you have some explaining to do. Soon, the Straw Hat crew, including the civilians, were marching towards Arlong's house, which stood out from the rest of the houses on the island. The civilians had grabbed pitchforks and other weapons despite Nami reassuring them they wouldn't fight and they just needed to watch. Genzo walked beside Nojiko while keeping an eye on Nami and the pirate crew. He was still wary of them, but if Nami said they were trustworthy, then for now, he decided to just watch and see what happened. As the Straw Hats stood before Arlong Park's entrance, Luffy stretched his arms before clearing his throat. It seems Arlong isn't really trying to hide himself. With a wide grin stretching across his face, Zoro eagerly exclaimed, well, let's get started. I can't wait to fight someone. As he deftly tied the vibrant green bandana around his head, his eyes gleamed with anticipation. Meanwhile, Sanji stylishly retrieved his lighter from his pocket, skillfully igniting the end of his cigarette. Bringing the smoldering stick to his lips, he drew a deep breath. He savored the intoxicating swirl of smoke that danced from within before gracefully exhaling, casting an enigmatic veil amidst the air. I'm ready, Usopp said as he drew his revolvers, filled with explosive rounds, and he had an entire box with flame rounds. I'll knock, Luffy declared with an air of detached determination, his voice devoid of emotion yet brimming with confidence. Without a moment's hesitation, he lifted his foot. With a swift and forceful kick, he propelled his leg forward, a thunderous collision reverberating through the air, shattering the silence and the very foundation of the imposing gates before him. Like a tempest unleashed, the robust iron doors were wrenched from their hinges, their once formidable presence reduced to mere debris soaring through the air. The gates soared through the sky. Amidst the chaos, a chilling symphony of metal meeting flesh echoed through the day as 5 unfortunate fishmen, their bodies now limp and lifeless, lay strewn across the ground. What the heck is going on? A fishman, frightened by the abrupt onslaught, yelled. They are dead. Another screamed as he saw his crewmates being shattered by the doors. As Luffy and his crew stepped into the park, he scanned the sea of fishmen with an air of nonchalance, their eyes filled with hostility. However, undeterred by their piercing glares, Luffy's gaze swiftly locked onto the figure seated upon a throne-like chair, Arlong. Luffy's eyes narrowed as he locked his gaze on the figure before him, a wry smile playing on his lips. The salty breeze swept through his raven-black hair as he confidently took a step forward, his fist slowly clenching and crackling with power. With a voice filled with curiosity and a hint of mischief, he broke the tension by questioning, You must be Arlong. Arlong scowled at the audacity of the human standing before him. His hardened features contorted with disdain as he responded with a mix of irritation and curiosity, Who the heck are you? Why would a dead fish need to know that? Luffy questioned, his eyes narrowed as he materialized right beside Arlong. Luffy's clenched fist collided in a split second with Arlong's face, causing an eerie distortion to ripple across the fishman's features. With an explosive force, Arlong was propelled from his ostentatious chair, hurtling through the air like a helpless projectile, only to meet an abrupt and bone-jarring halt against the unyielding wall that encircled Arlong Park, leaving a resounding thud echoing throughout the once dreaded stronghold. Boss.